Hi, welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Bruce Graham. He was a newsman for over 40 years, and then he put the news aside and he wrote a novel called the Parrsboro Boxing Club. Welcome. Good to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Now, all those years as a news anchor and producer and all those other things, did you always want to just sort of put the truth aside and sit down and make something up?
No. Well, I suppose I did as the years went on, and eventually you get your fill of daily news. But not initially, not even halfway through my career, but I think in the last few years I was even subconsciously thinking, I've had enough of this. I want to create my own world, not try to follow the facts of someone else's world.
And the world that you created was partly one that was a recreation, because you take us back to Parrsboro, a small town, coastal Nova Scotia, in the 1950s.
That's right. Well, they say write what you know. And Bernard Shaw said, you have to put your story in a place and time. If you try to write for all time, you'll be an all-time bore. So I wrote about what I knew, which was growing up in a small coastal town in the 1950s. And I wrote about relationships and boxing.
Well, let's go there for a minute.
Okay.
We're walking down Main Street in Parrsboro in 1950 what?
1955.
What do we see?
We see Dr. Henderson walking his big white dog up the street. We see old sailors sitting around on the steps of the post office. We see the last horse and carriage delivering groceries from the co-op. Those are the type of things you see.
This stays with you fresh in your memory?
Stays with you fresh in your memory, sure. I can close my eyes and be back there in a second.
Parrsboro is just down the road from Spring Hill, and it seems to me there's just one disaster after the next happening in Spring Hill. Did that have any effect in your life?
Well, I think it had some impact in my life. They used to have the miners' picnic in Parrsboro when I was young, and it was the day that the miners brought their families. They came down on the train and spent the day on the beach in Parrsboro, and it was always a bit of a rowdy day because there'd be a lot of drinking and some fighting. And, in the 1950s, towns were a little more wide open than they are now. So I always remember the miners' picnic day as the day when there were a lot more people on the streets and perhaps a bit more rowdiness. Now, when the mines bumped and they had those tragedies, I think it had an impact on us all. It's like the Kennedy assassination. You remember exactly what you were doing.
What was that, 56, 57?
56, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What were you doing?
I remember, I went up to Spring Hill with my father, and actually I put that in the book, and stood there at by the mouth of the pit.
Men were trapped underground.
Men were trapped underground. There was drizzle. The Salvation Army was serving coffee, and there wasn't a lot of talk. It wasn't a happy time, and people were just standing around in the rain. And in the book, I talk about one woman who said they've killed our sons. They've killed our sons, and that was true.
Mm. Boxing is one of the central elements of this particular story. Why boxing?
Because boxing is a contest between two people. I could have, I guess, done baseball or football, but boxing is something that I followed back in the 1950s. It was the kind of sport that would come to the small towns, and it had an intimacy that other sports didn't, the team sports didn't. Two people in the ring, and it was something that could be created in the basement with Duff Martin and his fathers. They could create the whole thing right in their basement.
Now, I'm that guy who, whenever I think about boxing, I think it's macho, it's brutal, it's potentially a horrible sport, but you don't exactly bring it forward that way, at least not entirely in your novel.
But
what's the other side of it?
Well, the other side of it is, and I think it's changed a lot in the last 20 years, you have to remember the 1950s were a time that it was after the war, the economy was booming, and those of us who weren't touched by the war, we were growing up in a life that to a great degree had a rosy glow about it. We didn't understand the criminal element behind boxing at the time. And boxers were idolized, much differently than they are today. You have all these ranks and all these champions, but you very seldom hear about them unless one of them happens to get in trouble. You know, boxing doesn't have the rosy glow about it had in the 1950s.
It was really glorified. A boxing champ was a rock star almost.
That's right, that's right. You know, Rocky Marciano, Joe Louis, they were heroes. They didn't make a lot of money, and what money they made was often stolen by their managers or other people, but they certainly, to young people, were heroes because remember, in the 1950s, we still had heroes.
Introduce me a bit to your main character, Duff.
Duff Martin, at the beginning of the story, is 16 years old. His father, maybe I should introduce you more to Alex Martin to start. His father was an up-and-coming fighter who was a promising fighter, was a champion in the military as a boxer, wanted to turn pro. Just at the time he was turning pro, he had an accident which shattered his leg. He couldn't become a professional fighter, but he started putting that dream on his son at a very young age. And Duff Martin carried that dream of his father and was in a way torn between his father and mother because there's some dynamic there between the parents with the son caught in the middle. And it has, to a certain degree, and people have asked me about this, about child abuse, because was the father abusing the son?
He was down in the basement
He was
boxing with his son when he was, what, 8 years old?
8 years old. Well, earlier than that. He was down in the basement boxing with his son, and he was putting this great guilt trip on his son if his son didn't rise to the level that his father thought he should have. On the other hand, his mother was a woman, a teacher, a woman of literature and books, who was trying to pull him in the other way. So Duff is caught between his two parents, pushing and pulling. To escape from that, he turns to the water, he turns to sailing, and he develops a love for sailing at a very early age. When his father dies and he's left alone, he's still got the push and pull, but it's internal as opposed to external. So that's what I was trying to create with the boxing club.
And sailing is kind of a counterforce to the boxing.
Very
isn't it?
much
It's
a
a very different
counterforce.
world. Are you a sailor?
No, I'm not. But I've grown up on the water, and I'm interested in ships, and the next book I'm writing is about ships. So no, I'm not a sailor, but I've been around boats in the water enough that I could write about it and feel fairly comfortable writing about it.
What does sailing do for Duff? It's
Escape.
Yeah.
It's escape. And in the 1950s, almost all young people in small towns wanted to escape. Just escape, because what strikes me, Leslie, is when I go back to Parrsboro today, I am blown away by how beautiful it is. And it's not just me, but it's all my contemporaries, all my friends say the same thing, that growing up in a place on the Minas Basin with those low-rolling hills and green fields and beautiful coastline, you don't appreciate it until you go away and then come back. And starting, I think, when I was about 35, I began to go back to Parrsboro and say, wow, this is the most incredible place in the world. But you don't see that at 16. It's a prison when you're 16. You're trapped. You want to get out. You want to see the world because everything looks better than the place you grew up. The girls look prettier in other places. There's more adventure in other places. It's a better life in other places. So you want to get out. And sailing for Duff Martin was his escape. And what he's really trying to do is escape from himself.
And that is part of that tradition of that Parrsboro shore.
Sure.
People would, in the 19th century, go out in the forest, cut down a few trees, build a ship, sail the ship around the world.
Yep.
Unbelievable.
Did it all the time.
Kind of,
Did it all the time.
Yeah, self-reliance there. What can you do in a novel that you can't do in the newsroom when it comes to
almost everything?
Exploring human nature, yeah.
Yeah. The news business changed a lot when the libel laws changed a lot. When the libel laws became stricter, news directors started worrying more about being sued.
When did that happen?
Oh, that happened, I suppose, in the 70s, in the late 70s, that people started actually suing the media for defamation. And not that they couldn't sue beforehand, but they didn't, as a rule. And it changed, and that was only one factor in a number of factors that really changed the media, and that change has gone on from, I'd say, about 1978 right through until the late 1990s, and probably right into 2000, 2001. The downsizing, the less time spent on investigative reporting, the less time spent on reporting, the more time spent on entertainment. They all have a role to play in changing the media. But to answer your question, what can you do in a novel? Fiction lets you be totally creative. You can put Duff Martin where you want to put him. You can create the mood. You can create the character of his mother. You can create her mood. You can create the dialogue and put it all together and mix it and match it in such a way that you just can't do in news.
The old adage, never let the facts get in the way of the truth. Fiction writer can say that. You can't do that as a journalist.
Well, one of the best broadcasters, a guy who, by the name of J. Paul Huddleston, who used to be the morning news reader in Los Angeles, used to say exactly that about news. And what he was saying was that you have to be very selective in a news story, something that is going to be heard or going to be seen, that's going to be over in a minute 10, and the viewer or listener is only going to have one shot at hearing it. What he meant by don't let the facts get in the way of a good story is be selective in what information you are giving to the audience. And so it's a little different.
What about that element of the phrase my producer here uses about news of feeding the monster? That there's always, this time that
you have to fill
with what's there.
Yeah.
Does that in any way distort reality?
Oh, sure it does. Sure, it distorts reality, and the media doesn't have a lot to do with reality anyway. The media, I suppose, creates some kind of false reality, but I don't think the media has a great deal to do with reality. But sure, if you're a television I have this theory that daily television kind of dulls the mind. It's emotionally deadening after a while.
This is from a man who's spent 40 years.
Well, sure, but if you go in every day and the first thing you face every morning is how you're going to fill 60 minutes every evening, and what are you going to put in there in critical content, you're going to end up putting a lot of things in there that probably don't deserve to be in there. And that's the lighter stuff, the feature stuff. There's very little hard news goes into a 60-minute newscast.
That's pretty scary. There seems to be a bit of a natural evolution between a number of news people writing novels. Robert McNeil's been on the show before, and yourself. What can a book do, the experience of reading a book that television can never do?
Well, a book creates scenes in your mind that television can't do. Television it's very temporary. It goes into your ears and into your eyes, and it's gone, and the next image is there, and the next, and the next. A book can create lasting scenes that television can't do. Television is very transitory, and a book is very lasting. So I think in short term, that's the difference. When
you were writing this book, did you know when you were getting it right?
Yes.
When you're on the money?
Yeah.
How could you tell?
Just the feeling. There's a creative sense that you know when you're on the money, and there's also there's a little voice that tells you this isn't right, this is cumbersome, or this doesn't work, or I have to change this. But when you're on the money, I think you know it.
I get the feeling that writing wasn't a painful ordeal for you. Some writers are slow and meticulous.
Oh, I am too at times. I mean, I'll write 2,000 words one day, and a few dozen words the next day. So I'm both fast and slow. Stephen King has a book, a pretty good book it's called On Writing, and he talks about somebody going to see James Joyce. And Joyce was complaining that he wasn't able to write anything that day, and the questioner said, well, did you not accomplish anything? And Joyce said, oh, I wrote about 7 words. And he said, well, for you, Mr. Joyce, that's not bad. He said, yes, but I don't know what order they go in.
My guest today is Bruce Graham. We're going to take a short break and be back right after this. Welcome back to Off the Page. My guest today is Bruce Graham. We're talking about news, and we're talking about his novel, The Parrsboro Boxing Club. In your days in the newsroom, did you ever regret putting a story to air?
Yes, yes.
Can you give me an example of something?
Nothing comes to mind right off the top of my head, but sure, there were stories as a reporter, not so much, but certainly as a news director, there were stories some days that I thought shouldn't have gone to air, but that we put them on the air. And I think any news director or any editor of any newspaper who's been doing it very long and who is being honest would say the same thing, because there are just days that you regret. Not because of the facts being wrong, but because the stories just weren't worth the time that they were given.
Yeah. Do you come into a big issue of freedom of speech versus invasion of privacy? Is there some kind of an equation that's being juggled in deciding what goes to air?
I suppose, but I don't think that the Canadian media, by and large, is as aggressive as the American media, and I think that editors and reporters in this country generally respect freedom of speech and privacy more than they do in the United States. Certainly, and I suppose the competitive aspect has something to do about that, because we tend not to be as competitive in Canada at the street level. I'm not saying that the guys in suits in the corporate offices aren't, but at the street level, reporters will even help each other out. I mean, I've seen that quite often over the years.
Oh, that's good to hear.
If somebody's in a bind or they've lost a tape, I've seen the biggest competitor come along and help them out. So,
oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I noticed that at one point there in your career, you produced a special on poverty. Any discoveries about poverty in Canada and Nova Scotia from doing that?
Well, there's a lot of poverty in Canada, and it has a way of being passed down from one generation to the next. And I think if I've learned anything about poverty, is that you have to break the cycle at a very early age with the next generation. Because if you don't, if you let children grow up in poverty, you're going to end up having a whole another 2 decades, 3 decades of poverty, and then the next generation comes along. So I think you have to break the cycle with the young. And the way to do that is, of course, through education.
Now, back in Parrsboro in the 1950s, people really didn't have a whole lot of money, but that wasn't exactly poverty, at least not the way you describe it in the book.
Well, there was poverty in Cumberland County. They didn't have all the social programs that we have today, and people were poor. I don't think anybody starved to death, because there was people helped each other out, perhaps more than they do now. But sure, there was poverty. There was poverty. A lot of people lived on the fringes, lived with not certain how the next meal was going to come along. There was maybe not so much Duff Martin's friends, although none of them in my book, none of the families are wealthy families. Duff's father runs a hardware store and his mother teaches school, and it's a challenge. They weren't wealthy.
Culturally, it seems we've come a long way from the 1950s, that world that you've created in your book. What do you think we've gained, and what have we lost?
Wow, that's a big question.
Well, I think of the 50s as being, that simpler time.
Yeah, it was
good and
simpler
bad.
time.
It was you figure it all out.
Yeah,
it's not that way anymore.
We've lost all the false heroes and all the authentic heroes that we had in the 50s. They're all gone. That's all stripped down. So some tremendous changes in society brought on by, of course, one of the big ones was television. Someone said to me at our high school reunion, we were the last generation that played, you know.
Yeah. Or boxed.
Or boxed, or did anything outdoors. You know, I spent my time skating and tobogganing and things like that. And we didn't have television. I think I was 17 or 18. But I was the last generation to spend all my time either outdoors or listening to the radio. That in itself changed society a very great deal.
Yes.
Television tended, I mean, look what television did. It covered the war in Vietnam, so we saw that war wasn't what we thought it was. The Kennedy assassination, it brought all these tragedies and all these people into our living rooms, and we saw that these people were indeed very human.
When you were growing up, you were a boxer. You boxed.
A little bit, yeah. Not, you know, I wasn't Rocky Marciano, but I boxed a bit. We boxed a bit in Boy Scouts.
Did you learn something from it? Those kind of life skills that you then adapted?
Yeah, I learned that I didn't want to be a boxer. You know, that's what I.
Okay. Safer
it's hard in the face
to be in television. You're working on a new project, and you're going further back in time. Just give us a little bit of an introduction.
It's called Death of the Dove, and it's about it's a story told through the eyes of a sea captain, and it takes in the years basically from 1850 to 1900. And it is about sailing, it is about places around the world, but it has its core in Nova Scotia, in Economy, Nova Scotia, and the Soley shipyard there, and the men who sailed the ships. And I'm writing this, and I'm finding all these kind of interesting bits of information that I didn't realize about what it was like living in the 1850s and 60s. For example, here's one. We think that the economy was invented in the 20th century, but in fact the economy was more important to people living in the 1800s than it probably is in the 20th century or the 21st century.
In terms of commerce and trade?
In commerce and trade, and it changed very quickly. I mean, the economy could change almost overnight, and it could drop.
The price of cod one day can sustain you.
Well, and war. Of course, war was very often the driving force of economic prosperity. So if you were building ships and had ships in the water just at the right time, you made a lot of money, providing your ships didn't sink, okay, or your captains didn't run aground or anything like that. And if you sold your ship at the right time, you'd make more money. So building a ship, sailing a ship, and selling a ship all are critical time factors based to them. The Boer War, everyone saw the Boer War is going to, now the Boer War started about the end of 1899. Everyone saw it as going to be a great economic boom, because here we were, Canada and Britain, going off to fight the Boers, and we were building ships, getting ready for all this prosperity, and the war ended. And all these ships that were built or nearly built really couldn't find any cargo. So it just...
There goes the economy and everyone with it.
There goes the economy, that's right.
My guest today has been Bruce Graham. We're going to take a real short break and be back after this. Watching Off the Page today with my guest, Bruce Graham. You write about the past instead of the present in your fiction. I'm wondering why.
Oh, I suppose because I spent so many years writing about the present in, you know, in the news business and even documentary work. We were usually writing about current affairs. So it's refreshing to go back and find these things about the past. And when you write about the 1850s and 60s, of course, you're writing about the U.S. Civil War, which had a big impact on the ships in Nova Scotia, and it's fascinating, and I don't mind it at all.
And we're too obsessed with the present. Bruce, thanks for coming on the show.
Okay, Leslie, thank you.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again.